On behalf of your city, the City of Melbourne, I want to welcome you to this talk by one of the world's foremost architects. Anybody who loves cities and asks questions about cities will be keen to hear Jan's reflections on his distinguished career and his view of what makes great cities. When I came here as Lord Mayor, I will confess I knew very little about cities and urban design. If I now know a little more, it's because I have been inspired by people like Rob Adams and Jan Gehl. And what they taught me was that cities are not really about architecture. They're really about culture. It's not really about the buildings of a city. It's what happens when those buildings hit the footpaths on the human scale. And that care for and defence of the public realm is what has characterised Jan Gehl's work, and if you've read his latest book, infuses that as well. And that relationship with cities also goes back with Melbourne, of course, many years. Jan has had a marked influence on our city's urban renaissance, working very closely with Rob Adams' team here at our city. And when I suggested to Jan today and asked him if the first time he was here was in the 1990s, he had a look of indignation on his face when he reminded me he was first here in 1976. But it was in 1994 that he formally explored ways of transforming Melbourne's urban culture. And you'll know the report titled Places for People. And that was updated in 2004 when Jan returned. I asked him today, if he had to look at cities, what would characterise ours? What's different about our city? What have we done well? And what have we got yet to do? And the thing that I was struck when Jan was talking to me about these very big things was his focus on the small things. He talked about trees. He talked about public art. He talked about street life and its vigour, which gives a city its quality and its character. He talked about footpaths and bike paths. He talked about cafes. He talked about small civic spaces. Well, all of that adds up in our city to quite dramatic change over the last few decades. And I think the custodians and the guardians of that, the guides of that, have been Rob Adams and Jan Gehl.
Never before have we been at such an important part in the development of the world as we know it. We know that we live in an urbanised world. 70% of us are going to live in cities in the next 40 years. We're going to double the urban population of the world. It's going to go from 3.5 to 6.4 billion people. That means we've got to build the same urban capacity in the next few years as we've built in the whole of mankind. That's our challenge. Those cities produce 70% of the greenhouse gases. They're responsible for 80% of the GDP. And they're where most of our people are going to live. We still, I think in Australia and in Americas, have an post-industrial revolution response to cities. We followed the Garden City movement, which meant we could try and live in the country and work in the city, and we built this stuff. And it worked for a while when distances were small, but as distances grew, we had more and more congestion. And this is an intersection in Melbourne today. This is behind the plenary hall. Our city is starting to fail on a metro level. Why do I say that? Because if you look at the trends and what's happening in our city at the moment, this taken from Griffith University shows you increasing poverty and social isolation. And you can see from years 2001 to 2006, the red and the orange increasing. We are building what I think could be a social catastrophe if we don't turn our city around. Our population's changing. The only sector of our population declining is mum and dad and 2 kids. All the rest are single or double-person families. Our population's ageing. Most of us are over 60, and that's increasing. The cost of putting development on our fringe is rated at about 1,000 houses will cost $300 million more than 1,000 houses within the existing infrastructure of the city. Enormous cost that we're going to achieve this. Yet, our latest plan for our city is to put 40,000 hectares of new development on the fringe of our cities. We're taking farmland and subdividing it. And even reports we read in the paper today is we're building more stuff on the fringe than we actually need. I think there was no greater time to think about how we design cities, particularly as housing alone in our cities is responsible for 8% of the GDP of Australia. Coal mining is responsible for 2%. If we put all of this stuff in the wrong place at the wrong time, we're just cementing in the hardship that many people are starting to feel in the city. I think tonight we're going to hear from Jan about another way of building a city, a way that is about people and a way that is about the 21st century. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome him here tonight. Jan.
After 50 years as an architect, it's very interesting to have the time to sit and think back at what actually happened in all those years. I'll talk about this. This book is very much about the change of paradigm, which I can see very clearly happened around 1960. It was a paradigm shift with 2 components. We started to build cities in another way. We had the car invasion. We started to have cheap petroleum, and we started to have cars in abundance, which were inundating our cities and completely changed our lives. This is the elements of this change of paradigm. In the 70s also, before I went down to Melbourne, I was in Toronto, and there I came to think about that if you walked around in the city, everything built before the Second World War was basically all right. And everything built after Second World War was basically not all right. Now looking back, I can see, and I call it the good old days, and that was another way of building cities. We were building cities in a continuous process. We've been building our urban habitat in the same way through centuries, and all the traditions were carried on and the experiences were handed on from one generation to the next. We built small installments, a couple of buildings in a street. We built along streets and squares, which we have always done throughout the history of mankind. And it was done by craftsmen, and so the world was evolving in a somewhat slower pace in the good old days. And we had all these traditional cities and all this heritage of how we built cities. All of them were made with the same 2 basic building blocks, which is the street and the square. The street is the moving space organized after our feet, and the square is the area our eye can oversee. And these 2 elements go through the entire history of human settlements. And we can see in the old cities how everything happened in streets and squares, and that everybody was out there on feet. The 3 traditional functions of the public space, the meeting place, the marketplace, and the connection space, were all organized by people on feet, and you could do it all in harmony together in the same space because it was all about people. You could carry your eggs, and you could look at the girls, and you could talk with your friends and buy an apple. You can do all of this in the same moment, in the same space, and in harmony with the other functions. Then came a change of paradigm. Around 1960, it really started to have a big effect, and that was the invasion of the motor car. And that happened in all the industrialized cities just about the same time. And the first thing which happened was that everybody took their new car and went down to Main Street to show the other ones that they've got a car also. And then in Perth and in Denmark, all over the world, the streets start to look like that. And we got a new profession of planners, traffic planners, who actually have been working very hard for the past 50 years to do what they have been asked to do, that is to make sure that we have capacity for more traffic in our streets. And they are basically trained to make cars happy, and they have become very, very good at that. And they have actually influenced our way of thinking enormously, so that nearly all of us think as traffic planners. When we do any project, we start to think about turning radius of fire engines, and we do all this stuff. And we started to forget what cities were about and started to be numb about quality. And in the end, we would think that this would be a fine Saturday morning in Ireland because people were not run over. And gradually, the people in the cities were treated more and more arbitrarily, while the traffic engineer was out repairing the potholes so that the cars could get on. Also in this process, there was something very important happening with the scale of our cities. In the old days, we have cities made for 5 kilometers an hour. And if people are walking, you can have small spaces, small signals, you can see the details, you can see other people. But suddenly we started to have a completely other scale, the 60 kilometer an hour scale, with large spaces and huge signals, and there are no details because you can't have time to see them, and you don't have time to see people either. And so gradually all people among the architects and planners and traffic planners and politicians, all of us started to get seriously confused about scale. Is this a good scale, or what was this scale, and what scale shall we make for this place? Confusion got worse and worse, and here is the famous city of Rodenburg up the Tauber and a Mercedes truck. They are just about the same size, as you can see. Confusion. The other important shift which happened around 1960 was that we started to expand the cities really fast. And the old way of doing it one building by one building and small installments couldn't be used anymore. We had, from the 30s, taken over a new philosophy, a new ideology, the ideology of the modernists, that maybe we can take the urban planning charter from Athens from 1933, all will separate residence, workplace, leisure, and communication. Less is more, and also cities are bad, freestanding buildings are good. Corbusier wrote a lot about how bad streets actually were. There was parliament of the street, there were barricades, there were street girls and street riots, and you name it. Get rid of streets, build single buildings, and put grass around. When I was in university, that was what we were taught. And also, we were taught with models how you should organize all your objects until you had a nice composition. Bingo. And this was the kind of stuff I rushed out of university to build, this kind of stuff to make people happy. Modern people should be happy in these modern towers. And then it happened that I married a psychologist. And then that was the beginning of a long conversation where these sociologists and psychologists started to ask, why are you architects not interested in people? And we thought we knew everything. And they say, you know this much, you know. And that was the beginning of a long story of my world, my life, of studying how physical form and life interact and what influences the life, rather than only studying the forms. So we had this change of paradigm. What really happened was that I think that the planners, they went up in the big scale, they went up in the aeroplanes and started to organize all these objects from a safe distance of 5,000 feet or 5,000 meters. And from that distance, all funny shapes looked quite interesting. And also there is the other scale, the intermediate scale, the site plan scale. I could also say the helicopter scale or the rooftop scale. That would be for the individual neighborhoods, whatever. But again, they were done from above. And then the scale which always were the most important and which we have worked throughout history of mankind carefully to look after, the people scale, the city at 5 kilometers an hour, the city at eye level. Nobody was commissioned to look after that. And that was why one place after the other started to look like this. That became, for the reasons of this happening, that became a void, a place nobody was looking after. And thinking about it, I think that has been a problem now for almost 50 years. There has been a number of attempts and a number of things done, and I shall try to talk a little bit about it. Already in 1961, Jane Jacobs wrote her famous book that if the modernistic planners and the traffic planners are to rule this world, it will be the death of the great cities, the great American cities. She was fighting a really interesting battle with Robert Moses, the traffic and the planner in New York, who had this vision of modernizing New York by putting freeways across Manhattan, several places, tear down redundant old areas like Greenwich Village and Soho and Little Italy and Chinatown. Redundant. There should be high-rise towers standing alongside the freeways. That would be New York for the future. Unfortunately for him, Jane Jacobs lived in Greenwich Village, and she took up the fight. She was a journalist with the Architectural Record, and it's a very, very interesting story how she actually, with a lot of people from Greenwich Village, managed to stop this cross-Manhattan freeway. And I have a little picture here showing the subtle access to the freeway through Washington Square Park. So this was the kind of stuff which was proposed and which was stopped. Jane Jacobs won that battle. The freeway didn't cross Manhattan at that point, but Robert Moses won all the other battles in New York, and New York got filled with cars from wall to wall anyway. We all read and have all studied Jane Jacobs and admire her, and she was the first one who started to look out of her windows and talk about the people which made Greenwich Village, the street ballet, the safety of eyes on the street, all these things she introduced. And we know these things, but looking back from now, I do think that it's amazing that she hasn't had more influence in real life. There's just got a new mayor in Calgary, and he started by saying, my political program is I'll introduce Jane Jacobs 40 years later. We started to have the Brasilia Syndrome, I call it. That is city planning from high above, where you organize your objects. This is the Swedish professor, and he was saying all the time that the virtue of residential building is that it should look nice from the freeway. And I think that he's very careful here. So the planners left the ground and left the people dimension in planning and started to fly over the whole thing. It was planning from above and from a distance. Brasilia is the obvious example. It's one of the most famous modernistic cities. It was a competition in 1955. From the air, it looks smashing. It's an eagle with wings and with the government buildings. And from the helicopter, it looks really good. And down in eye level, it really looks shit. Because nobody thought about that the Brazilians would walk around in this, which was all planned from an aeroplane and from helicopters. And for the Brazilians to be happy there, they should have a helicopter, each of them, and I think they will not be happy anyway. But this is just a typical situation of all this which is done with a concern for the big scale and the intermediate scale and no concern for the people scale at all. I think this is characterizing of many, many new districts, including some by the waterfront in this city. And we've seen it being used all over the world, in China, in Dubai, whatever. We've seen this planning from the airplane being done. I call this kind of the planning I call it Birch sheet architecture, that the architects fly in and fly out same day and drop some buildings here and there, which are no context. I do think that Dubai is an excellent example of this, that you don't get a city by dropping a number of towers next to each other and a freeway. Here are the usual suspects. I'm sorry about that. They look like somebody from Sydney, but they were so kind as to pose for a picture I needed for this book. And that's poor City Hall in Sydney down there. But let's not look at that. But that's the principle, that you're looking down from a big height. And this is a new town in Holland. It's a brand new plan. And you can almost see them hovering over that plan, saying that 2 oval buildings would be just smashing. Yeah, let's do 2 ovals. And then let's have some yellow cubes. Yeah, yellow cubes. Let's turn them 45 degrees. 45 degrees, that would be excellent. But how will it be for the Dutch people who are to live in this one for the next 50 years or longer? Anyway, the planners didn't take up the human scale and look after it. What about the architects? They could have been the good guys in this story. I think that unfortunately they are not the good guys, because I rather think that we as a profession basically got very happy of being freed of the chains of building in an urban context and being allowed to do freestanding form. And I think that as the years have gone, and I've been in University of Architecture School in 40 years and taught, and I know how the obsession with form has become more and more evident. And you can go to Dubai and go up and down there, and I think that the buildings look more and more like perfume bottles, where everybody is trying to find a new twisted form which can catch the imagination. But that's not the way of making good cities for people. It can be worse, like in this exhibition from Tate Modern in London, and you think now it cannot be any worse. Yes, it can. This is a new residential project by Frank Gehry in Brooklyn. The residents in Brooklyn hate it, and the developers love it. And I think the residents have good reasons to be very worried. Whenever the skyline is more interesting than how the buildings land and what kind of city we get at eye level, there is reason to be worried. Also, in these 50 years, we've seen an increasing scale confusion, not only because of the cars, but also because all the functions have become bigger. We can build bigger and bigger structures, we can build higher and higher, and so gradually we have forgotten that man still can walk with 5 kilometers an hour, that man still is this big, and we start to see these landscapes where you feel completely alienated. The Singapore River example is very good, where you have the old colonial architecture, and next to it you have the fly-in, fly-out, same-day architects' towers. This is Kenzo Tange, by the way. And in the evening, as you know, everybody sit in front of the low houses in the good human scale and have meals, while there's not a soul in front of the big one. The big one is made for dinosaurs, and the other one is made for people. And that is part of this great confusion about scale, which is also part of our professions today. So, in conclusion, I do think that most of the architecture and many architecture schools, they are also deeply confused about scale, and they are confused about, they have more or less forgotten, many of them, that good architecture is not about form. It is about the interaction between form and life. And life is much more difficult to define and study, and the interaction between form and life, that's what makes good architecture, and that has not been studied very much. On the contrary, we get more and more obsessed with the form. At no time in this period, in these 50 years, have people really liked this kind of planning. There are many pieces of evidence about not loving it that much. Even in Melbourne, it's even worse because they even pinpoint who are the culprits. This is 35 years old, so the news have been out for a while. What then about the landscape architects? They could be the good guys in this story because they at least are down at the ground at eye level and they are creeping around there. And I think that they do, quite a few of them do nice things, but I think also that profession, if we look out over it, has become increasingly obsessed with form for form's sake, and of course also with a number of biological and ecological issues which are important. But if you look at all these professions, the architects, the planners, the traffic planners and the landscape architects, in none of these curriculums, in none of these studies, are there any systematic and good teaching about human scale and people in cities. That is overlooked. That's not interesting enough. That leads to problems, of course. One would say that they are not really interested in people, but that is not true. Yeah, this is the result. If nobody has the task to look after people, you can get a place like this one, and I can give a written guarantee that nobody would come anywhere near this place voluntarily. But these guys, all these people in the planning, architect and landscape, whatever profession, they are very, very interested in people. And you can see that whenever they make any project whatsoever. It is crawling with happy people who are walking in all directions, seemingly aimlessly. We call it unspecified public life. And it doesn't depend on if it's on the north side or the south side or it's on Greenland or it's in Arabic countries. It's the same story all over, that all the projects are full of happy people, showing that the purpose of doing all this is to make people happy at ground level. So this is Daniel Libeskind in Copenhagen, and by making these two towers, he will have all these happy people there. This is from Barangaroo in Sydney, and it looks like the rush hour in Singapore. And all of them, all of us do it, because if there are people on a scene, it's a sign that there's quality. Because if it wasn't a nice place, people wouldn't have come, and if it wasn't a nice place, people would have gone home immediately. So if there are people, it must be because it's a good place. So we always put people there to signalize it is a good place, whether it's a good place or not a good place. The reality, which we can see in many cities, many times like this. Welcome to London and have a nice promenade. That's next to City Hall in London. Or here, Rem Koolhaas is doing a bench for contemplation and concentration in Lille. Here is a wonderful bench where you can bring your loved one and you can discuss details of your visions for good life in the future. So we all know this, and all cities have examples of this lack of care for people and lack of care for the little scale, the people scale. I will end this part by inviting you to this very, very dull area in Copenhagen. You fly over it, it's absolutely boring. So from the airplane, nothing to write postcards about. From the helicopter, from the rooftops, if you presented such a thing in city planning or architecture, in School of Architecture, you would be thrown out as without vision and without understanding of what good architecture is. So this, from the it looks very bad. But down at eye level, it has all the qualities you could ever ask for. So the little scale is fine here, but the other scales are not so fine. And if we look closer at this one, it's from Copenhagen. And we found out that this area has the highest concentration of architects' families in Denmark. The mayor lives here. The city's chief city architect lives here. Half of the professors of School of Architecture live here. On some of the blocks in 40 buildings, there will be 17 architects' families. So these guys know exactly what is good for their own bodies and their families, whatever, and that is interesting. Also, it's some of the highest real estate prices in Copenhagen. My point is that if you make the places nice for people, people can have a very good life, and they are not so worried if it looks bad from an aeroplane. They have not time to think about it because they have such a cozy time down between their buildings. So the end of this is that the most important scale of all is the people scale, and that's the city at eye level, the city for people, the city for 5 kilometers an hour. That is the scale and the story I've tried to tell about in this book, The Overlooked Scale in City Planning. After 50 years, I will say now that we definitely have another change of paradigm. What is wanted now, and we are asking more and more seriously about this, we want livable cities, we want attractive cities in good scale, we want safe cities, sustainable cities, and healthy cities. And my point is that if we are sweet to the pedestrians, to people walking, and sweet to bicycles, we actually address all these important issues in one policy. I will not have time to go through this in detail, but just rush through it, saying that if you have to choose between having a lively city and a lifeless city, you will pick the lively city. And there's a number of reasons for that. And some changes in society, smaller households, more leisure time, fewer kids in each household. There are many, many reasons, like why the public component in our social life has an increasing importance, and there are good reasons why whenever we do good public places, the people will come in great numbers and use them. If they don't, it's because they are not good enough. You also, if you build a city for people, you get a more attractive city, a city in a more nice scale, and also a city where you will get attraction number one in our lives, which are the access to other people, watching girls and all that. I always thought that maybe you will stop watching girls after a certain number of years, but I can assure you that what is beautiful continues to be beautiful, and interest in other people is throughout life, from the very first day to the very last day. Number one attraction. You have a safer city because if there are people around, it's perceived safer, and it is safer. You have a more sustainable city because the more people walk and bicycle, that in itself is very important and a good thing to do. But good public transportation and a good public realm, they are brothers and sisters, because to have a good public transportation system, you have to get to and from your light rail and your train, whatever, and you have to do it by all time of day and night in safety and comfort. So these things are interlinked. And we have increasingly the problem of creating healthy cities. And we have realized by now that we can do a lot in city planning to have healthy cities and prevent having unhealthy cities. Many cities now have policies that we shall walk and bike as much as possible in this city, because that's a very, very good policy for the health budgets. I always thought it was obesity, that people got too fat, that was a problem. Then I met these doctors that said, no, it's inactivity. If you sit on your behind morning, during the transport, during work, during the transport, and all evening, day after day, that is what is the problem. You can be very slim and inactive, and you are in trouble. You can be very fat and active, and you will be fine. So 1 hour of moderate activity like walking for an hour a day or bicycling for an hour a day will keep the doctor away. Actually, you will have 7 extra years of life expectancy, and these years would be generally good years with not too much medicine and hospital and whatever, and there will be great benefits for society if we move. And that's why we try now to put activity and movement into the ordinary pattern of people's life, instead of expecting them to take the escalator up to the fitness center, because we realize that many doesn't do it and many haven't got time and energy and a few other things. So it's much better that you just walk and bicycle as part of your life. So I will now come to the second part, and I know that time is running short, and I will of course speed up, or say at least I will. For many years, when all this happened, we didn't really know that the way we built our cities influenced our lifestyles. Now that is well documented, and we can say with great sureness that first we shape the cities, but then certainly the cities shape our way of living and the quality we can have in our lives. We also know that it's right down to the buildings or the individual rooms in the house that we can shape the places, and then the shape will shape some of our opportunities. You can make cities where you will never stop because the city signalizes, go on, my friend, go home and watch video. Or you can make a city where every little nook and cranny invites you to sit down and stop and linger and whatever. We know that there's a lot of influence from the architecture to the behavior. All this is known now. I'll tell you something about invitations. What happens if we make more invitations for more traffic? We know that exactly. We get more traffic. And we've known that for 100 years, and every city has an arbitrary level of traffic depending on how much asphalt they got in the first place. It's very interesting that when you reduce the number of asphalt, which is very difficult because a lot of people will yell and scream and say that these roads are given by God and you cannot touch our asphalt. But if it's God, like in the earthquake in San Francisco, who rattles the freeway so it can't be used, then San Francisco would die because the bloodline for San Francisco, Embarcadero Freeway, was not usable. And before they found out what they should do to rebuild Embarcadero Freeway, they found out that San Francisco was doing fine without the freeway, and the freeway is now a boulevard with trams. So the traffic found a new level. You could never have done that for the sake of mankind, but if God rattles the freeway, that's act of God. That's all right. What happens if we are sweet to bicycling? And I shall go a little bit into this because that is one of the policies that are also followed now in New York, in Melbourne, in Sydney, in a number of cities. Even in Washington, they have bike lanes down the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue pointing to the Congress. In Copenhagen, there has been for years and years a bicycle tradition, and very early on they started to build a complete system of bicycle lanes in every single major street, proper bike lanes next to the sidewalk and protected by curbs. And we call these the Copenhagen-style bicycle lanes. That means that the parked cars, they protect the bicycles instead of the other system where you use the bicycles to protect the parked cars. In Copenhagen, this has been developed over the years into a really efficient transport system. You can easily have a good life without having a car, and you can transport whatever. Every third family with children in Copenhagen have a cargo bike so they can bring the little ones to kindergarten and school, and there is a heavy traffic of cargo bikes by now. A lot has been done to make it safer all the time with crossings, with special lights. We even have green waves now. We used to have green waves so that traffic could run smoothly out of the city at rush hour. Now we have retimed the lights so that the bicycles can go 20 kilometers and never stop when they go home after work. Of course, in a good bicycle city, it should be an integrated system so that you can get your bike on all the various modes of transport. All taxis take 2, trams, metro, take your bicycles for free. And that's a fantastic thing, because then you suddenly have a system. You can live in a suburb, take your bike, take it on the train, go to the city and continue. Fine. So all this has been built up, and I know that we've been at it for 50 years in Copenhagen. By now we have a distinct bicycle culture. Everybody and his uncle bicycle, and it's sort of lifestyle to bicycle. Businessmen bicycle, pregnant women, mothers bicycle. The Lord Mayor arrives in his town hall every day on his bicycle. The politicians love to be photographed in the television coming up to Parliament and park their bike. Even the bass players bicycle. And okay, yes, the Crown Prince of Denmark is also found to be doing it. And there's good news there, because the kid here is 50% Australian, and that shows that Australian can learn if they... Now, they have expanded the training to 4 half Australian kids, so the thing is spreading. Tell you about bicycle culture. My wife and I, we celebrated some years ago our 45th anniversary. It was a nice summer day, so we took our bicycles. We were not quite young at that point. And then we bicycled on all these nice bicycle lanes, side by side, and in all the crossings they were safe crossings. So we bicycled in comfort and style. We bicycled around in the city and across the harbour, and finally we found a nice place, a sidewalk cafe where we could have a meal. And then we went back, and of course you can wobble a bit after the dinner. You can have an extra glass of red wine if you're on bicycle. And when we came home, we realized that we have done 20 kilometers on bicycle on this occasion without thinking about it, just pedaling along. And then we talked about it, and we realized that when we were married, all this was not possible. This has happened. And also we had this feeling, and we have that in Copenhagen, that every day you wake up is a little bit better than the day before. And that's a fantastic feeling to have in a city. And that we do have in Copenhagen. This, from London, it would be starting in Hyde Park and going over past King's Cross and over to Southwark and whatever, and go back again. Long trip. All the progressive firms in Copenhagen now have company bicycle helmets. And what has happened is that we see bicycling growing every year, and now the growth of the bicycling has become quite a bit of a problem, which is interesting, but it's much easier to solve than having too many cars. Bicycling has doubled. And now we have 37% of everybody going to work on bicycle every day, and 70% continuing. And we have, over the time, got more and more problems, because we have a mayor complained about there is too much congestion on the bicycle lanes. So what do? We have, on some of the streets, they count 36,000 bicycles a day on these key streets in the city. And actually they want to have more of this, because it's very good economy. They found that if you do a kilometer on a bike, the society earns $0.25. If you do the same kilometer in a car, the society loses 60 cents. So the more people you can get bicycling, the better for society economy. It's a complicated calculation. You can also see that we don't have compulsory bike helmets. They found that if they introduce compulsory bike helmets, we can reduce bicycling by 50% overnight. And they say that it's much better for health economy that we have many people bicycling much, and then we will take the risk of some of them getting injuries while they are young, but it's much better that they continue and they are old, whatever. And they have campaigns, and now a third have bicycle helmets, and I think it's very wise not to make it compulsory. So we can choose. In certain stretches, I always take my bike helmet. Going down to the tennis club, I don't, or going to the corner store, or whatever. What is happening now is that they are taking an extra lane from all the streets and giving it to the bicycle. They are doubling the width of the bicycle lanes. They have also started a new program of having relief bicycle freeways going through parks and old disused railway lines, so that we have street bicycling and park bicycling, which gives more capacity. The city is putting up bridges all over the place, across the harbour, across the bigger streets, so that bicycles can do shortcuts and whatever, and it's growing and growing and growing. And of course we have also other new problems. All these cargo bikes, they pile up on the sidewalks in front of residential buildings. But then of course the vice city fathers, they have invented the solution, that is a car which can take up one parking space, and you can park 4 cargo bikes there. That means in one space you can have parking for 12 people instead of parking for 1. Unfortunately, they are not so smart yet, but they can become more elegant as times go by. What happens if you are sweet to walking in a city? And again, Copenhagen is an interesting place to study. They started 50 years ago to pedestrianize the first place, and everybody said it will never work. We are Danes, not Italians. It will be a dead whatever. It worked anyway, and they have expanded the system for many years. And to realize when that was the year after Jan Gehl started to raise the alarm in New York. Then they started to push back the traffic in Copenhagen. They were responding to the same challenges. What was unique about Copenhagen is that was the first city in the world where the life in the city started to be studied just as carefully as the traffic planners were studying the traffic every year. We started to count the pedestrians and see how many people were sitting on cafes and on benches every year, so that there was a tradition of documenting life as carefully as the traffic planners always documented the traffic. That started in Copenhagen and is now spread to many, many cities, realizing that to be good to people, you have to know something about how your city is being used. Then you can make a plan for how you can improve it. So we know from Copenhagen that if you're sweet to people, more people will be walking. Many more people will be sitting and enjoying, and then we start to go into the quality thing, because if many people walk in a city, it's not necessarily a sign of quality, but if many people stop walking and start to enjoy, they only do that because it's a nice place, it's a nice thing to do. We've seen the outdoor season expanding all the time. When I was a young architect, we heard we could never have sidewalk cafes in Copenhagen, and it was too cold. Then some people started to put them out, and they were out for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. Now they are out for 10 months, and with the new smoking law, we haven't got any winter no more. We have 7,000 cafe seats, as opposed to Melbourne, who had 7,000 5 years ago, but now have 15,000. That's amazing. But it's important that it's not about city centre. It's about having a walking policy for all the neighbourhoods, so that it's easy to walk, it's easy to cross streets, it's easy to get to school and whatever. And in Copenhagen, they have systematically taken all the streets were 4-lane, 5-lane streets with asphalt from wall to wall. All of them have now been readdressed with a median and 2 lanes, one in either direction, with street trees, with sidewalks, and with bicycle lanes and parking under the trees. So the streets are much more beautiful, and they are much safer, and they are much more people-friendly. and they can almost take the same capacity because modern traffic planners are smarter than the old traffic planners were 20, 40, 30 years ago. We have not reached this stage yet. No. But what is being done is, again, to signalize to the people walking and bicycling, you are just as important as the other ones. So in the major streets, the sidewalks are always taken across the minor streets. And that in itself is a nice signal, but for my grandchild, who is 8 now, it means that she can walk to school, because my daughter will say, Laura can stay on the sidewalk all the way to school, so it's safe to walk to school. Earlier on, she had to pass 3 streets, and that's hell of a difference for an 8-year-old if she can walk on a sidewalk to school or if she has to negotiate 3 streets. Now it's the cars who shall negotiate 3 sidewalks. Copenhagen now has a policy. They want to be the best city for people in no time to speak of, and unfortunately it involves that all of us shall walk 20% more in just 4 years from now. Will have more people to walk more. There is a distinct walking policy. Do we find this kind of policies in other places? Yes, we do. And I will not tell much about Melbourne, because you know more about Melbourne, but I can tell you that around the world, Melbourne is internationally known as one of the finest, most progressive modern cities who have very much this people-oriented city policy. From the air, it looks like any city in the New World. And of course, I was here in the 70s as a visiting professor at the University of Melbourne, and was it a boring place? Oh my dear. It was called the Donuts, and I remember weekends in Melbourne City. Oh my dear. And you made all these improvements, and I'll not go through them, but I'll say that you also have started a tradition of documenting how life is depending on what you do for it. If you invite people to walk and bicyclists to bicycle, all we know is that there will be more people walking and more people bicycling. We have these figures from 2004 that there are many more people a day and twice as many at night, and 4 times more people sitting and enjoying, which is a sign of quality and that people like the place. It has been reinvigorated enormously, this city. And I would say that even if it looks like any city from an airplane, it looks like Paris at ground level, almost. And just to mention something, Swansea Street, which has been debated for the last 25 years or 20 years, we could see, of course, that just between 1995 and 2004, there was a fantastic increase in the number of pedestrians, and 5 years ago, Swansea Street had more pedestrian traffic a day than had Regent Street in London. And I was told by Rob that it's up still further, and I can hardly wait to have it documented so we can say that if you make nice streets, invite people to walk, then you will see walking increase, and you will have a livable city, which indeed you have. And now you are into the bicycle thing. I'm very happy that some of them will be Copenhagen style, where the parked cars protect the bicycles, which is very important. Just north of here, actually, yes, north of here, you have this other city which is very good for Olympics and summits and parties, but is really lousy when it comes to quality in the city centre. It's really appalling. The mayor from London visited Sydney and he said, oh, it's even worse than London. Ken Livingstone. There is now a very big plan, and I'll not go into it, but they want to turn George Street into a Swansea Street with light rail and bicycles and pedestrians. And of course, you know, George Street today is a mess. One thing they're good at in Sydney is posters. They haven't really come around to doing too much, but they're good at posters. And the whole city is full of encouraging messages from the city council. Now we are doing 200 kilometers of bicycle ways in this city to combat the climate problem. We will make it easy to use your bicycle, and we will make it a city for walking and bicycling. They are going to invigorate, and it will be green and revitalized. They have all the plans, and they remind the citizens all the time that this is what we do, and we do it for mankind, and we do it for our next generation. And you must realize when we take your parking spot away in front of your shop that this is for mankind and not to hurt you particularly. We can push it just a little bit further out, but Cycleways is good. They started in 2008, and I was very happy about this particular event because I saw this Danish flag flapping in the background, and I thought, gee, what's that doing here? And then I realized that was the pub where our crown prince met the Tasmanian princess in that corner. So this is now, of course, Copenhagen corner, and the year later they had put the bicycles infrastructure. The Danish flag was still flying there. It flies there forever. And they are at it in Sydney now also with great vigor, and I think that's lovely to see one city after the other take this direction. I'll end, and you'll be very happy to hear this. Oh, my dear. I'll end in New York, where the mayor, Michael Bloomberg, some 5 years ago, he finished a plan where he promised the world that New York, in no time to speak of, would be the greenest, most climate-friendly metropole in the world. Part of this plan was there was 1 million commuter cars in Manhattan. He wanted them to disappear because they had a very good subway system, and the streets were wide, the buildings were concentrated, and the terrain was flat, so you could have a first-class bicycle system in New York. So bicycling, walking, and taking the subway would be the melody of the future. In New York, you have endless number of people trundling along on the sidewalks, but only going from A to B because there are no seats, there are no benches, there are no cafes, really almost nothing. If you're tired, go down to Central Park. It's 4 kilometers that way. So they wanted also to improve the conditions for walking and improve the conditions for public life in the city. Bicycling were used to protect the parked cars. If there were lanes, that was the thing. They had posters showing the situation. And then they started with a bang. They have a very ambitious plan, and they are pouring out bicycle lanes in a tempo you cannot imagine. You come in the spring to 9th Avenue, and you come there in the fall, and then it's full of bicycle lanes. And again, the parked cars are protecting the bicycles. And they are doing it in all the boroughs, Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, whatever. And as part of this plan, they also want to have a Swansea Street in New York, and they were looking to, that we have no boulevards, Champs-Élysées, whatever, but couldn't we use Broadway maybe? And then they started to widen the sidewalk on Broadway, and they put bicycle lanes the length of Broadway, and then they started to think about that maybe they didn't need Broadway in the traffic system after all, because every city has the traffic they provide asphalt for. So if they provided a little bit less asphalt in New York, maybe it would survive. They figured out that maybe Broadway could be taken out of circulation. Not that it is a pedestrian street, but in the key places where it crosses the avenues and where all the congestion is, they have now stopped Broadway as a traffic street and created public spaces. This is Broadway in front of Macy's, what is called Herald Square. They started it in 2009 in May, and in 2010 it looked like this. And it was done as an experiment, and it lasted for 6 months, then it was made permanent, because it was such a success. Among other things, turnover in the shops have gone up with 70%, and when they asked the people in New York, would you like us to keep this? A resounding, yeah, for God's sake. It's untouchable now. I will end all this story about looking after cities for people by saying, with Frank Sinatra, when you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. You are well on your way in Melbourne, but keep at it. Build cities for the 21st century. Thank you very much.